So the genesis for this is the non-proliferation background, which has been covered in quite a lot of detail previously in this conference. So in the interest of time, I'll try and skip through some of that. And then I want to contextualize this is very much a focus on the UK current submarine industry, and so focus on the current UK policy and standings, and how the genesis from a risk in the Non-Proliferation Treaty could affect those things, and basically then proposing a solution, which is reprocessing of submarine fuel and talking about the general pros and cons and future policy considerations for that. So the non-proliferation background. We've talked about 3 pillars in the first presentation. I just want to reiterate some of the language from that. I realise I'm but a lowly engineer and not a policymaker, but I understand language is important for you guys. So the enable right and the right for NPT signatories to develop civil nuclear power, I think, is a must as a caveat to signing the NPT treaty. But it also recognises that we shouldn't proliferate nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices. Now, to me, there's a grey area in this, which excludes defence nuclear material which is not considered a nuclear weapon or a nuclear explosive device, mainly nuclear propulsion plants for submarines or for aircraft carriers. So when you look at the bar chart that you see there is a measure of an enrichment level of U-235 as a portion of U-238. U-235 is a principal isotope that we burn in reactors and can be used to generate a nuclear weapon. You have what's defined as low-enriched uranium, which is in general what civil nuclear power plants use. And in the IAE legislation of that, it is defined as below 20% U-235 into U-238. Now, to give you a comparison of the scales, natural uranium, when you dig it out of the ground, has an enrichment level of below 1%. Roughly, you need to enrich that capacity to roughly 3 to 5% to make it reactor grade. So reactor grade generally sits below that low enriched threshold. Weapons grade can be up to 100% U-235. And so weapons grade comes into the classification of highly enriched uranium, which if low enriched uranium is below 20%, highly enriched is just above 20%. Now, in general, when you look at naval propulsion plants, there's a growing trend for those to have the stored energy for the life of the submarines, and therefore getting the power density required, the general trend is to use highly enriched fuel, which can be anything between 20% and 100%. So you have this interesting quandary where you have a platform which can be used for nuclear weapons, i.e. SSBNs, and also, much like the intercontinental ballistic missile is a part of the capacity to deliver the nuclear capability. But you also have the support structure that goes along with that. If you say, I'm going to build my centrifuges to produce highly enriched uranium to support my nuclear propulsion plants, you also have that capacity. So you have this interesting scenario where you do have NPT signatories that have been in the news, Brazil, Argentina, that are at least pursuing or scoping out generating naval propulsion plants, and other non-proliferation treaty signatories, notably India, who are also developing nuclear submarines. So really recognizing this potential grey area where you can generate highly enriched uranium for use in a nuclear propulsion plant, which is not a peaceful use of technology, though not a nuclear explosive device or a nuclear weapon, we have this interesting grey area. And so all I'm putting out is, in the future, policymakers may wish to close that gap. And so is there a risk of this NPT loophole being closed? Say, within the next 50 years, moving at the timescales that international politics can. The reason for that timescale is important because when you look at the lifetime, the procurement, development, and use of submarines, the timescales for treaty change and the timescales for developing new submarines are comparable. And so, from industry, looking at these timescales, it is important to factor those into what we're doing in the future. And so, if there's a potential for this loophole to close, and this would potentially restrict fuel into the naval propulsion programs, the value of your existing assets increases, and therefore, as spent fuel still contains fuel, does reprocessing become more viable? So, if you look at roughly, if you burn, I don't know, 10% of your uranium in your reactor, you still have 9% of the U-235 left. It might be economically recoverable to reprocess that fuel. So what is the current UK policy? We have a recently declassified picture of Successor on the left that I stole from the Telegraph website, so I can get that in there. So we have a potential to commit to a future Vanguard replacement. We also have an ongoing Astute class in the UK, so we're presenting ourselves with a future commitment to the industry. And at the moment, there may be replacements to those classes as well, so an ongoing look to produce naval propulsion plants. Therefore, should we be looking to preserve our stockpiles of spent nuclear fuel? Well, when you look at the spent nuclear fuel, you've got to go to the policy document which governs our decision-making process on that, and that is covered in the Mod Nuclear Liabilities Management Strategy, which covers a broad spectrum across the mod estate, inclusive of spent submarine fuel. Though the specific points that cover submarine fuel to talk about the sale or transfer for processing into new fuel. Now, this has a caveat where it describes ongoing discussions with the NDA. So I interpret that as the sale or transfer from a mod-owned liability into the sale or transfer into civil fuel, and therefore removing it from the mod stockpile. Also, disposal in a deep geological disposal facility, which is currently undergoing planning and took a step back in the early stages of last year. So both options act to reduce our inventory, which, if we have a risk of this NPT loophole closing and a potential restriction on supply, is that a sensible option. So my third option, as I've already alluded to, is the option of reprocessing. Now, reprocessing provides an interesting example. I suppose been a bit provocative saying it's failed in civil. It has had a long history in civil. However, it probably, the open fuel cycle is becoming the standard fuel cycle, principally because there has been a low feed cost of uranium, and the initial capital outlay is the dominator of the economics of your technology. Though it has developed a well-established process, the PureX process, which is the plutonium-uranium redox extraction process. And the picture that you see there is a picture of Thorpe, which is in Cumbria in the United Kingdom, that has operated and reprocessed significant amounts of civil fuel. So we have significant skill base within the UK. Now, reprocessing doesn't remove the liability by reprocessing it and putting it through a submarine or aircraft reactor. Doesn't mean that you're not going to have waste ultimately at the end of it, though it does reduce the short-term pressing issue of disposing of the fuel. And also, there's potentially, if you're using highly enriched uranium fuel, to simplify the PureX process, and I'll go into that on my next slide. De facto, by saying that highly enriched fuel is between 20 and 100% U-235 and U-238, there's less transient elements developed once you've had once that fuel's been through a core life, because U-235, which is the isotope which has a high propensity to absorb neutrons, has a lower is not as probable because it's not as much stuff is there. So transuranic isotopes are just those that are higher than uranium in the periodic table. And those elements behave chemically similar to uranium because they have such large electron clouds. And so they become difficult when you're reprocessing to strip out the uranium from those other transuranics. If they're not there, your potential number of washes that you require to get the required purity to go back into a reactor for your reprocessing potentially drops, and so presents a potential cost saving. Also, because you are generating less unstable heavy elements, you have a reduced amount of alpha emitters relative to civil fuel. And so you have potentially less damage to an organic solvent. An organic solvent is used in that material. So because you're not bombarding it with highly ionizing alpha particles, could potentially increase the residence time of your organic solvent. And because you don't have as much U-238, you have potentially less plutonium generation, and therefore a reduced criticality concern because the criticality considerations of plutonium is higher than that of uranium. However,
2 minutes, Nick.
Okay, no problem. Because, sorry, throw me slightly there. because you're reprocessing highly enriched fuel, you still have criticality concerns. It doesn't remove it. It might allay them. And this shouldn't be underestimated. See the Tokamura incident where it was reprocessing highly enriched fuel. So overall, the consideration and the idea is this a risk that we should be concerned of? This can feed into how we go about not designing our submarines, but how we procure the fuel in the future. Is it possible to retrofit an existing supply chain? We have a supply chain in the country that produces these bespoke reactors. Is it possible to retrofit that existing technology into the current supply chain? And a thing that I find when people talk about reprocessing, they say it as a solution to waste. This is not a solution to waste. In the long term, though it can provide a short-term saving, and so it bears discussion. Thank you.